Hello, and welcome to the next episode of The Prestige, a podcast about films, filmmaking, and film theory.
Each week we'll focus on a particular movie chosen by one of us and let a theme develop out from a review or discussion of that and see where it takes us.
And as always, we'll end with some recommendations based on this week's films, based on the themes, based on discussions. Be always open by introducing ourselves. So who are we? My colleague on this podcast is Sam B. Knowles, a published author writing about books and movies and comic books and pop culture and racism and all the kind of world of literary theory around those things. He's been my friend for far too many years. He's seen half the random films that I make him watch over the years, and we've been ranting about movies for about a decade and a half, and we thought we'd put it on a podcast for you guys. My name's Rob Maythorn. I am a film colourist and photographer. I spent the last 10 years working in the British film industry, working on small productions, big productions and everything in between. These days I make films about photography. I run a video series called Kaiju Academy, in which I teach people how to take photographs and how to make better photographs. So Sam.
Yes.
This week's film,
Looper. Set in 2044, Looper deals with the subject of hired killers who dispose of targets sent from the future, 2074, via the highly illicit medium of time travel, which has been invented in 2074 but is only used by criminals. These mercenaries, called loopers as a result of their indebtedness to a loop in time travel, are themselves disposed of by the mob. So sent back in time for their former selves to shoot, whereupon they have 30 years of highly paid retirement before death. And our two leads in this film, Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce Willis, play two incarnations of one looper 30 years apart. Now, I really like this film, and in order to like it, there is a massive suspension of disbelief involved, and I would encourage none of you to focus don't focus too much on the plot, because the required suspension of disbelief becomes too much and the whole film comes crashing down. But this is the basic setup. Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Bruce Willis are two incarnations of a looper. They encounter Emily Blunt, who is living as a single mother with her only son. And the movie goes from there. So, Rob, your thoughts?
I saw Looper at the cinema when it first came out. Being both a fan of the director and its two main stars, it was right up my alley. And it didn't disappoint. I think Sam's right that if you poke too hard at the underlying logic of it, it tends to fall apart. But I would say that's true for almost every time travel film out there. Because time travel essentially is a fantasy construct, we haven't got hard and fast rules of how it works. And unlike something like, I don't know, warp travel from other films, where we can go, well, these are the rules, time travel is so far out of our world that you can't do it. So I'm happy to suspend that disbelief, shall we say. I think the film, from a sort of design and production stance, did great work. It really felt like, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, in that it didn't feel like Star Trek. It didn't feel like we're living a whole new world. It didn't feel like Tomorrowland. It felt like a slightly worse and slightly more advanced version of today. And I kind of like that. It felt like it was kind of that Minority Report style near future rather than future tech.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that the two main guys who do carry the film very much, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Bruce Willis, both playing Joe, I think they're both really good actors. I think both did really well here. They did a lot of prosthesis work on Joseph to make him look more like Bruce. And at times I found that a bit distracting.
Right.
Because it's that strange suspension of disbelief we have in a film, where you can look at someone and go, well, yeah, they're a doctor, they're a scientist, they're an astronaut. And we believe that. But I kept looking at Joseph Gordon-Levitt going, you don't look like that.
No.
And I don't know whether it's just the prostheses aren't as amazing as they have been in other films, but I just kind of at times didn't buy that. And I think he did a great work of kind of having a similar mannerisms. He felt acting-wise and style-wise and character-wise, he nailed that whole Bruce Willis style very well. But sometimes the hair and the makeup kind of knocked me out of that a little bit. I thought Bruce Willis was great. He had that kind of what he does. He has that grizzled, old, I've seen it all, world weary, but also felt like he could do the things he does in this film. He isn't a good guy in the film, despite everything that happens to him, and his intentions very much are honourable, but he isn't a good guy and he doesn't do good things. But you felt like he knew he wasn't doing good things.
Yeah.
And there wasn't any glee in it. There wasn't any kind of... There was remorse and there was acceptance that he was doing... He knew he was doing bad things, but he saw the end goal. I love Emily Blunt. I've got time and time with that woman. I think she's amazing, and she lifts everything I like in it. I don't think it was as revolutionary as something like The Matrix or that kind of ilk of film, but it was certainly better than most dumb action films that come out these days. Sam?
Yes, I agree with you that it's not amazing, but it is a perfectly serviceable film. And I particularly like, something I really liked about this is what you brought up there, is that this is a vision of the near future, and some things are better, but some things are significantly worse. And it is an extension of ideas about commercialization and capitalism, and you have obvious inequalities at the very beginning of the film. So this is a very believable social environment, and you have Seth having to go at a beggar right at the beginning, and you think that is uncomfortably close to any number of other situations you could think of from now. And I really like that this wasn't. It's something I haven't put it in as a recommendation for this week because I can't bring myself to recommend such a terrible film. But it's something that Johnny Mnemonic did very well. Is that there is one part of that that is actually really good. If you're willing to suspend disbelief to a certain extent and forget the fact that it's being acted by a complete imbecile and so many other things about that film, but there is actually a really good, there's a grain of good about that film. So yeah, not a recommendation for this week, but I do think that there's something of that movement into the slightly something. There's a combination of utopian and dystopian future to this. That yes, there are good things, but yes, there are fundamentally bad things as well. And I thought that Rian Johnson got that combination exactly right.
Yeah, I think that for me is what often sells this kind of sci-fi to me, is that the film has a world that has a premise based on that world presenting, but you don't spend too long on it.
Yeah,
the cars are a bit better. There's a hover bike. There's slightly better guns or slightly different costumes, and it gets that world building out of the way so quickly and so fast and so smoothly that the film then becomes about character rather than about the trappings of this future world.
Yeah.
And I think so often sci-fi films get lost in that kind of, look at all the cool things we can do now. We've got teleporters. Whereas this kind of took the idea of time travel and ran with it to a point where it's about character within that, about identity and that kind of thing.
Yes. I also really like the way that there's something that's sort of celebrating. Oh wow, isn't amazing? We've got hoverboards. That attitude to futuristic filmmaking that this film definitely didn't have, and it's brought up by something like the TK attributes right at the beginning. The focus on telekinesis has it's only really sad people use it to chat up girls in clubs, and that is it's just a matter of course. It's what happens right at the beginning of the film. So whatever happens later in the film to do with telekinesis, right at the beginning you've got Johnson or the script or whoever it might be being particularly dismissive of this one futuristic element.
I think that echoed again in the hoverbike. Now, in the film, Seth, the best friend, has a hoverbike, and it never works. Joe has a car, and it's lovely, it works, but it's like this idea of the future, this hoverbike that they have, it just fails at the start, and it almost gets Joe killed later on. And the film ends with almost a comically tiny little smart car van thing, and I think that's, as I say, that kind of, this is the future, but it's got the shine knocked right out of it.
And you have
aside,
I'm just thinking of that moment when Joe shoots an agent of bike. I can't remember his name. Is it Jesse?
Yes.
I haven't watched too much Breaking Bad recently. No, it is Jesse. And he he rides off a bike into a dust cloud that Joe throws up, and Joe shoots him off his bike. And the end of that little scene is a hoverbike grinding to a halt. And you think that is a metaphor for that part of that aspect of the film that you've just brought up, is that there are certain futuristic parts of this film that just get ground into the dirt and just quite literally disposed of in that scene.
I would agree. I think that's where the kind of, is this film sci-fi, and that's where what is the nature of sci-fi comes into question a little bit, because sci-fi often, as I said, can be about the science fiction. It's a fiction about science, and if it's set in the future, is it inherently sci-fi? Or is it just a story about people that happens to be set in the future? I haven't watched it myself, but Parks and Recreation, it's a very popular series, and from what I gather, the last series is about 5 years in the future.
Right.
But I wouldn't call it sci-fi, that kind of show.
No, exactly.
And I would struggle to call this sci-fi in many ways. And I think that sometimes we're very keen to slap everything with the title of sci-fi if it's in the future.
Yes, and you have something, like you, I haven't seen Parks and Recreation, but I have seen the latest series of House of Cards, which this is I'm aware that you don't give spoilers for anything on Netflix nowadays, so I'm not saying anything when I say this focuses on the 2016 election and the run-up to that. So there are parts of this series which sort of move into the very slightly near future in the same way. But you would never call that sci-fi. You'd never even call that speculative fiction, the sort of overarching umbrella. So I think that's something that I wanted to bring to the table this week, was the idea that there are, and we've had before, gangster films which are not about gangsters, and this is an example of a fantasy film or a sci-fi film that's very definitely not about science fiction. It is about the relationship between Joe and Emily Blunt's character, or Emily Blunt's son, or the relationship between the different incarnations of Joe. And I think it's much more interesting to think about the film in those terms than to necessarily focus on the hoverboards.
Yeah, I think the one note I made watching this is that in many ways it's closer to a Western than it is to a sci-fi film. I think, especially if you look at some of the stylings of the Gap men, and there's a lot of kind of Western themes certainly on there. But it just had that same kind of feel of the soul the sole gunslinger
Mm.
against an army or against the man in black. And for me, it felt very Western, and especially the sort of some of the shootouts were very kind of standoffish, staring across an open field, and it really kind of struck me as you say, like, it's a sci-fi film. It is in many ways, but it's also, I felt, a very Western kind of style film in that old West tradition. And I think if there's a flash forward, shall we say, into Joe's life post being a looper, and the scene that in which the Rainmaker, who's the big nemesis in the future, his men turn up to capture Joe, and they almost couldn't be more Western. They're so kind of with the wide-brimmed hats and the long sort of dust jackets. And despite being set in the future in Shanghai, very much what I got was that kind of Western theme from it.
And actually, one of the things that Ryan Johnson said about the film is that it was only set in Shanghai for financial reasons, and he, as is fairly obvious by the beginning of the film, he wanted Joe to go to France.
Yes,
and there is that sense that there's a return to Europe, and maybe there's a sort of return to sort of quite subconsciously European filmmaking about it. That he didn't want to go into the future in Shanghai. He definitely wanted to go back to quote unquote the old world.
I think that this is where we get into kind of the world of hard sci-fi versus soft sci-fi, if you know what I mean by that, Sam.
No, say more.
Okay. In a very loose term, hard sci-fi is the fiction of science. So hard tends to be military sci-fi.
Right. Yes.
It tends to be much more focused on the harshness of science and technology and that kind of thing. And it tends to, within a certain world, play by realistic rules. So the idea being that the science, whilst being fantastical in its own way, is rooted in some kind of science. So in a literary way, things like Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars and that kind of 80s sci-fi is very hard sci-fi. It's all about what would really happen. Right. If we went to Mars, how would we do it? Really, how would we do it? And obviously there are inventions of narrative to keep it interesting, but hard sci-fi is more concerned with the realities of science.
Right.
Hard sciences in that kind of academic way. Soft sci-fi is much more about the kind of everything around that. So, I mean, the great distinction would be Star Trek versus Star Wars.
Okay.
Star Trek, whilst it does flirt with being softer at times, is probably more hard sci-fi. In that there are theories behind why warp travel works, how phases work, and there is a hard science behind everything that happens, even if it is fantastical. Star Wars is laser swords and Jedis. And there isn't a hard science behind what happens on the screen.
No.
If you see what I'm saying.
I was thinking, actually I was talking to a colleague today about thinking of literary and cultural examples of various tropes, and we were thinking about how something like Star Wars is very Shakespearean, and we were trying to think of it in Shakespearean terms. This sounds a less interesting conversation than it was, but there is something in that you can take Star Wars and, well, it's been, you can hear it say described as a space opera, as a soap opera set in space, and it's just a timeless story taken and transplanted into this particular arena, wherever this story comes from.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a nice way of looking at it in many ways. And I think that there's this film, like, I think it's kind of sits somewhere between the two, because as we said, it isn't about the science. And I think there are a few paradoxes in it, and there are some things that are, whether they work in the world of causality and time travel, I don't know. but it does have rules within itself, and it does tend to stick to those rules. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't be sure where to put it down, because it does feature telekinesis, but it is presented as like a random mutation in the populace rather than, you know, anything more. And I think that's what it kind of sticks in the kind of like whether it is hard or soft sci-fi. If we do, even if we won't put it in sci-fi at all.
Yeah. I wonder, actually, and this is something that's come to me just now, but I wonder whether there's a movement from one to the other, whether one of the two is becoming more. I don't know. Is it something to do with the way we think about the world now, that we're more prepared to look at the world in terms of hard sides?
I think yes. I think that there's. I would say for me, culturally, there's two big proponents of that are pushing forward. One of which I think is we are in an age of tech.
Yeah.
You know, the amount of technology that touches our lives, and the amount of sort of even like column inches, shall we say, that is devoted to technology, and we aren't in a great cultural revolution. We aren't in a great social revolution, particularly. We are in the middle of a great technical revolution.
Yeah, and that's something we've talked about before with the strides forward in formatting and art that we talked about when we were talking about the monuments. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that the other push is, I suppose, the rise of dystopia. That these days you don't see many utopian films. I mean, of utopian films, for a narrative point of view, tend to be dystopias, really. But certainly with the rise of YA fiction, things like Hunger Games, The Maze Runner, that kind of fiction, and both the rise of dystopian zombie movies are dystopian fiction generally. And that part of that, I think, is linked to things like the economic collapse and the general feeling that the world isn't getting better.
Yeah.
That we're getting fancier toys, but there is, I suppose, a general zeitgeist that the world isn't getting any better. Even though I think qualitatively it probably is getting better. You know, the crime is down, quality of life is improving, but we certainly in the UK are not being sold that narrative. And it's not one that we're buying into. You know, everyone's buying into the world that life's just a bit crap these days.
It's something. Did you see Humans? There's
I haven't seen
TV
Humans.
series on Channel 4 recently. Well, it's good, and it's from the same stable in terms of editing and sound and music and some of the cast, as well as Utopia, which was brilliant a couple of years ago. But Humans plays with this idea of you have sort of the Tomorrow's World fantasy in the opening credits. This is not giving away what happens in it at all. This is right at the beginning. You have it set up as, wow, isn't it amazing what robots can do for us? And that's the narrative that's presented right at the beginning. And the whole program is about, well, what happens when something else happens to these robots, to humans, to the relationship between man and human, between robot and human. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's why kind of the rise of the dystopian and the hard sci-fi, and why we're more in a hard sci-fi era right now. I mean, there's a film coming out that's been trailed a lot called The Martian.
Yes, yeah.
And I've based on the book, and the book is straight up hard sci-fi. It's infamous for being he's made one leap in technology, which is that spacesuits are easy to get in and out of. You can do it yourself, and that is the only leap in technology that he's made. Everything else in that book is all real science.
Right. Okay.
And it's had great plaudits because of that. And I do think we're in that kind of era. And space travel is, you know, we are currently reaping the harvest of the 15-year ago boom in space travel. Because we're seeing Pluto, we're landing on comets and that kind of thing. And I do think that there is a rise in that kind of hard sci-fi currently. The only other thing that kind of kicked out to me, which is moving away from the science fiction thing a little bit, is the idea of identity that the film plays with.
How do you mean?
Because we've got these two Joes, which essentially are the same person, but also different people. they are different people in life, but their interaction sends them down different routes. But you get old Joe suddenly having memories of new Joe, or young Joe, sorry. And there's interesting ideas, I think, around who are you the sum of your actions, the sum of your thoughts? If old Joe starts taking on the memories of young Joe, is he a different person? I think that the film, between those two characters, has some interesting things to say about identity, and especially the idea of sort of fate, because of the whole predestination of the Rainmaker and that kind of world, the idea of this loop. It's in the loop of time and causality that they try and break, shall we say. That there is this idea of who are people? Are we predestined to do certain things? Is time a flat circle? Like, what the film, I think, is asking some interesting questions under the layer of this action film about what it means to be a person, if you look at that on a longish timeline.
Can you stop talking now, because my head hurts?
Sorry.
Yeah, and no, I see what you mean, and also it's not just Joe, not just the identity of the protagonist. It's the identity of the Rainmaker as well, and well, that you even get that in his name, which, if you haven't seen it written down, the notes I was jotting down as I went, I heard it as Rainmaker, as in your reign on this earth, and it was sort of a world building thing about him, and he was constructing his dominion. So that's what I heard it as, and I think that's something that the film encourages you to think, and it goes on, and you find out that actually it's Rainmaker in terms of sort of making the crops grow, and that's an interesting thing to think about in itself, given that you see Emily Blunt starting up a machine to water the fields right at the beginning. So you have a primitive, sort of primitive crop duster, but actually it's a leap forward in technology. But you have that within the character of the Rainmaker himself. You have this. Well, are we talking about worlds being built here, or are you talking about something to do with harvesting, to do with reaching back to the previous time? And I think that's, like you said, that's something that the director plays with in an interesting way.
I think that there's looking beyond the two main. I think if you can look at the film, almost every character in it has two identities. You've got Sarah, Emily Blunt's character, who is this kind of farm girl, stay-at-home mum, but you learn was previously a city party girl. You've got Piper Perabo, who plays a stripper and a single mum. There'll be the two versions of Joe. You see two versions of Seth, the main character. You've got Kid Blue, who is the sort of the one-footed Gap man, who's desperately trying to be someone he isn't. I think there's a lot, and even in the main character of Abe, who is a guy sent from the future to run the loopers, he clearly has the two lives of the future and the now. And I think that a lot of the film does kind of has ideas of duality, of the identity isn't a fixed point, that you can have more than one identity at the same time. I do think the film kind of handles it beautifully by Bruce Willis saying, we are applying hard language to a fuzzy concept. And I think with this film, this film is the fuzzy concept, and we're the ones trying to apply hard language to some of the ideas presented. I think it's unfocused, but that kind of works.
Yes, and I also think that, I've said right at the beginning that there are huge plot holes here that it could trip you up, but actually they aren't really. This isn't really a problem if you go with the film, and if you go with this idea of a fuzzy concept, and it's an interesting exploration of the relationship between the now and the future, and the passage of time, and there are lots of interesting things to think about, like the fact that Bruce Willis is supposed to be from the future, but he's older, and I know it's a really obvious thing to say, but that's something that you don't generally think about much. You don't think about the passage of time, and it's not something that's brought to our attention very much. And he comes from the future, and yet he is this character's past in a way.
And the future feels old.
Yes.
Everyone you see from the future, Abe, Seth, Joe, feels that they're older gentlemen, and it feels old, certainly.
Yeah.
So, Sam, any recommendations based off this week's film?
Well, yes, I had a few. I'm going to get rid of that one because instead I'm going to recommend one that came to mind when you mentioned westerns, and I really think a good companion film to this is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because particularly the end of Looper, I suppose, and the end of Butch Cassidy, and the way it plays the idea of someone existing and not existing in this film, Looper. But I think that Butch Cassidy would be a good one to go back to. And my other more obvious one is I'm sorry to do this to you because I have a feeling I'm stepping on your toes again. But I would say Interstellar.
Okay.
As a brilliant, if you can get past certain jumps in logic, then it is a brilliant exploration of time travel and of space and of the relationship. Also, something we've talked about in this podcast, the way that sci-fi films can be used as an exploration of the relationship between people. And I think of the relationship between the protagonist and his daughter in Interstellar, particularly, and his daughter who becomes older than him. I think Looper is a good example of that relationship between generations, and also this idea of combine the old and the new in a believable way, and you have the farms of the future in Interstellar feel like sort of the Dust Bowl farms of the Midwest that you have in Looper, certainly. So those are my two fairly different recommendations for this week.
Fair enough. As a quick aside, and we'll cover this at one point, I'm sure, really didn't like Interstellar.
Okay, right.
But we'll cover that in another episode. So, my recommendations for this week are both... Well, first up, there's a slightly obvious one, which I'm going to get. It's called Brick. Brick is a 2005 film by the same director, starring Jason Gordon-Levitt.
Right.
Which essentially is a jet black film noir set in a high school.
Okay.
It comes complete with its own slang, its own bad guys and good guys, and all the trappings of a hard-boiled detective film noir, but set in an American high school. Jason Gordon-Levitt plays a loner trying to discover trying to find his missing ex-girlfriend, and the world's populated with stoners and drunks and jocks and cheerleaders, but all playing roles of femme fatales and mob bosses. It's hard to explain, but suffice to say it's brilliant. The acting is superb, and the direction, the ability of Rian Johnson to mix things together is evident here. I would heartily recommend Brick. Secondly, is a film from 2004, so just a year earlier, called Primer. Have you ever seen Primer, Sam?
Nope. No.
Primer is a film about...
Extended paint advert. No.
It's a film about time travel.
Right, okay.
And it is the hardest of hard sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
It is entirely based on a scientific reading of time travel about some friends who invent it, basically.
Right.
And it's about them as a group of friends and how they fall apart and all that kind of thing. The mechanics of sci-fi, of the time travel, once again, aren't covered. But it is, if it can be said, one of the most realistic portrayals of scientific invention that I've ever seen on screen.
Okay.
It is an amazing film. It won hundreds of awards. And that is my recommendation. It's in that if you took all the Hollywood tentpole trappings away from Looper and just focused on the ideas of what time travel can do, this is what you get. It's a hearty recommendation from me.
Great. And talking of hearty things from you, what is your heartfelt recommendation for next week?
My heartfelt recommendation next week is a film that not many people have seen. I've seen it before. I loved it. I want to cover it here. It's from 2012, and it's called Beasts of the Southern Wild. Beasts of the Southern Wild is essentially the story of a 6-year-old girl living in the bayou in America, and the life of her and her father.
Right.
But it's so much more than that as well.
Good.
And I don't want to cover too much. We'll cover it all next week. But that's my pick for next week. So, guys, if you're watching along at home, please go and find it. I don't know if it's on Netflix or Hulu or any of these things. Go and find it. It's a very interesting film, and very interesting to talk about with Sam.
Good. It was one that I meant to see at the time and was annoyed that I didn't. So I'm pleased that we're going to get a chance to talk about it. And I will spend the week practicing saying Convention Wallace.
Yes.
Alternatively, I'll just record myself saying it once. If you would like to get hold of us, please do on Twitter at Prestige Podcast or me at life_academic.
Or me at Rob Kaiju.
And please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, recommendation, like on iTunes, SoundCloud, however you listen to the podcast. It's greatly appreciated, and we do want to get to as many people as possible.
So thanks, guys, and we will see you all back here next week.
Bye.
The Prestige is a Kaiju Industries production. Check out their other work at facebook.com/Kaiju Industries. Rawr! Arg.